Cold open. Visual, pitch black screen. A single, rhythmic, low-frequency heartbeat pulses through the audio track. A waveform appears on the screen, spiking violently with a sudden, ear-piercing metallic clang, then cuts to dead silence. Narrator. Cold, analytical, detached. Fear is traditionally understood as a biological imperative. An evolutionary shield. When a predator approaches, the amygdala floods the nervous system with cortisol and adrenaline. The pupils dilate. The heart rate accelerates. It is the body's ultimate survival mechanism, forged over millions of years to keep the human organism alive in a hostile world. Pause 3 seconds. But what if fear is not an instinct? What if fear is simply a mechanical output? A programmable response, no different from a line of code fed into a machine. Visual, slow, degraded archival footage of a bustling 1920s city street, transitioning into the imposing, Gothic architecture of Johns Hopkins University. If you can program fear, you can control the organism. You can dictate its aversions, its paranoias, its entire psychological architecture. In 1920, the scientific community did not merely ask this question. They tested it. They did not test it on a rat, a dog, or a primate. They tested it on a 9-month-old human infant. This is the classified architecture of the Little Albert experiment. An operation that stripped away the sanctity of human emotion and reduced terror to an industrial process. Title sequence, Dark Psychology Factory Episode 23, The Manufacture of Terror, The Little Albert Protocols. Act I, The Tabula Rasa Protocol. Visual, a sterile, dimly lit interrogation room aesthetic. A classified dossier slides across a steel table. The name, Watson, John Broadus, is stamped in black ink. Narrator. To understand the mechanics of this psychological weaponization, we must first examine the architect. Dr. John B. Watson was not a healer. He was an engineer of human behavior. By the early 20th century, the field of psychology was dominated by Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalysts. They believed human behavior was driven by deep, unseen subconscious desires, intangible, unmeasurable, and subjective. Watson despised this. He viewed the psychoanalytic method as pseudoscientific mysticism. To Watson, the human mind was not a mystical landscape of dreams and repressed memories. It was a biological machine. Visual, blueprint-style graphics appearing over an anatomical diagram of the human brain, drawing harsh geometric lines connecting the eyes, ears, and the motor cortex. In 1913, Watson published his manifesto, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. It was a declaration of war against traditional psychology. Watson proposed a radical, cold-blooded theory, behaviorism. Behaviorism postulated that all human behavior, no matter how complex, was merely the result of conditioning. Stimulus and response. Input and output. You provide the correct environmental input, and the human machine will generate the guaranteed output. Watson famously declared, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and, yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." Pause 2 seconds. It was a terrifyingly arrogant claim. It reduced human consciousness to clay, waiting to be molded by an omnipotent creator. But Watson did not want to mold a doctor or a lawyer. He wanted to mold a phobia. He wanted to synthesize a psychological disorder from scratch. Visual, faded photograph of Rosalie Rayner, staring blankly into the camera. The image is slightly distorted, grainy. To execute this, Watson required a laboratory, a co-conspirator, and a subject. The laboratory was the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University. The co-conspirator was his 21-year-old graduate assistant, Rosalie Rayner, a woman with whom Watson was engaged in a scandalous, highly classified illicit affair. And the subject? The subject was sourced from an environment of absolute vulnerability. Visual, slow pan across a bleak, cold corridor of a 1920s pediatric ward. The words, Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children, fade onto the screen. Just blocks away from Watson's laboratory was the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children. It was a facility housing infants whose parents were either destitute, incapacitated, or absent. Among these children was a boy Watson referred to in his clinical notes simply as Albert B. Albert was the son of a wet nurse who worked at the hospital. He was chosen not for any special abilities, but for his absolute lack of them. Watson's notes described the infant as, on the whole, stolid and unemotional. Albert was a blank slate. The perfect biological hardware upon which Watson could install his malicious software. Act 2, the baseline calibration. Visual, a clinical checklist appears on screen. Subject, Albert B. Age, 9 months. Objective, establish neutral baseline. Narrator. Before you can measure the destruction of a psychological profile, you must first establish a baseline. You must prove that the fears you intend to implant do not already exist. At 9 months of age, Albert B. was brought into Watson's sterile testing environment. The methodology was brutally straightforward. Watson and Rayner presented the infant with a series of stimuli designed to test his innate responses to the world. Visual, rapid, clinical flashes of archival-style footage. A white rat. A rabbit. A dog. A monkey. Masks with and without hair. Smoldering newspapers. They placed a live white rat in front of the child. Albert did not cry. He reached out, curiously touching its fur. They brought in a rabbit. Albert showed no fear. A dog. A monkey. Cotton wool. Even a burning newspaper. In every single instance, the biological machine known as Albert B. registered a neutral or positive response. His heart rate remained stable. His breathing was unhurried. He exhibited the natural, uncorrupted curiosity of a healthy human infant. Watson's meticulous, detached notes confirmed the terrifying reality. At no time did this infant ever show fear in any situation. Pause 3 seconds. Albert was uncorrupted. He was safe. But Watson knew that while the human infant has no innate fear of animals or fire, it possesses two hardwired, evolutionary vulnerabilities. Two fatal flaws in the biological code that cannot be unlearned. The fear of a sudden loss of support, falling. And the fear of sudden, deafening noise. Visual, a blueprint of a steel bar, 4 feet in length, accompanied by a heavy carpenter's hammer. Dimensions and mathematical equations regarding acoustic resonance surround the image. Watson had his entry point. He had the back door into Albert's nervous system. The researchers procured a steel bar, 4 feet in length, suspended from the ceiling. They acquired a heavy carpenter's hammer. The auditory output of striking this bar with maximum force in a closed, acoustically reflective room was deafening. It was a concussive shockwave designed to instantly trigger the infant's Moro reflex, a primitive, involuntary survival response causing the baby to arch its back, throw out its arms, and gasp for air. The trap was set. The neutral stimuli had been documented. The unconditioned weapon, the deafening noise, was ready. The experiment was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a countdown to psychological demolition. Pause 2 seconds. At 11 months and 3 days old, Albert was brought back into the laboratory. The calibration was over. The programming was about to begin. Act 3, the conditioning protocols. Visual, the screen splits. On the left, a clinical stopwatch ticking. On the right, a cold, clinical ledger titled, Conditioning Log Session 1. Narrator. Slow, methodical, almost robotic. The protocol for the weaponization of classical conditioning requires absolute precision. It is an algorithmic process. Identify the neutral stimulus, introduce the unconditioned stimulus, and force a neurological association until the neutral becomes the trigger. Watson and Rayner placed Albert on a mattress in the center of the room. There were no toys. There were no comforting variables. The environment was sterile, designed to isolate the psychological variables with surgical ruthlessness. Visual, recreated footage from a high, security camera angle. A white laboratory rat is placed on the mattress. The infant reaches out. Step 1, the introduction of the target. A white laboratory rat was removed from a basket and placed on the mattress next to the infant. As documented during the baseline phase, Albert exhibited zero apprehension. His left hand extended toward the animal, his fingers brushing the white fur. Step 2, the acoustic strike. Directly behind Albert's head, entirely out of his field of vision, Watson stood holding the heavy carpenter's hammer. The steel bar hung motionless. Just as the infant's fingers made contact with the rat, Watson swung the hammer. Audio, a sudden, violently loud, metallic clang that vibrates the audio track. Visual, the screen flashes blinding white for a fraction of a second, then snaps back to the clinical ledger. The physical reaction was instantaneous. The concussion of the sound wave struck the infant's eardrums, sending an immediate distress signal to the amygdala. Watson's own notes describe the event with chilling detachment. The infant jumped violently and fell forward, burying his face in the mattress. He did not cry, but his breathing was altered. The organism was shocked, but the programming was not yet permanent. The neurological association required repetition to rewrite the brain's synaptic pathways. Watson waited. He allowed the infant's heart rate to stabilize. He allowed the cortisol levels to momentarily plateau. Then, he presented the rat a second time. Once again, Albert's natural curiosity overrode the lingering shock. As his right hand extended toward the rat, the hammer struck the steel bar. Audio, a second, deafening metallic clang. This time, the biological defense mechanisms completely overloaded. Albert collapsed onto the mattress and began to whimper. The baseline was broken. The first lines of malicious code had been successfully installed. Watson terminated the session, noting that they needed to allow the infant's nervous system a full week to incubate the trauma. Pause 3 seconds. Visual, the screen fades to black. Text appears, 7 days later. When Albert was brought back to the laboratory at 11 months and 10 days old, the researchers needed to verify if the psychological infection had taken root. They placed the rat on the mattress. No sound was made. The steel bar remained silent. Albert did not reach for the rat. He stared at it, frozen. His body tensed. The neutral stimulus was no longer neutral. It had become a harbinger of unseen, auditory violence. But a mere hesitation was not enough for John B. Watson. He required total psychological submission. He required a permanent phobia. Over the next several minutes, Watson and Rayner subjected the infant to an unrelenting barrage of combined stimuli. Rat presented. Hammer strikes steel. Audio, clang. Albert falls sideways. Rat presented. Hammer strikes steel. Audio, clang. Albert begins to cry violently. Rat presented. Hammer strikes steel. Audio, clang. Albert's nervous system completely shatters. Visual, slow motion, distorted visual of an infant screaming, though the audio is completely muted, replaced only by a low, terrifying drone. Watson's final entry for the session is the closest a scientific document can get to a confession of psychological torture. He wrote, "The instant the rat was shown, the baby began to cry. Almost instantly he turned sharply to the left, fell over on his left side, raised himself on all fours and began to crawl away so rapidly that he was caught with difficulty before reaching the edge of the table." The objective was achieved. The rat, once a source of innocent curiosity, was now fully synonymous with the terror of the deafening strike. A severe, artificial phobia had been successfully manufactured and implanted into a healthy human brain. Act 4, The Contagion of Terror. Visual, a microscopic view of a virus replicating and spreading across cellular structures, tinted in a sickly, clinical blue. Narrator. In virology, a successful pathogen does not remain confined to its initial point of entry. It adapts. It mutates. It spreads. Watson and Rayner had proven they could engineer a specific fear. But a far more terrifying question remained: would this synthetic phobia remain contained, or would it metastasize? Would the infant's brain, now fractured by trauma, begin to categorize all similar objects as threats? In psychological terms, this is known as stimulus generalization. Visual, the clinical ledger returns. Subject, Albert B. Phase, generalization testing. 5 days after the conditioning sessions, Albert was placed back on the mattress. The researchers did not bring the rat. Instead, they brought a rabbit. Before the conditioning, Albert had played with the rabbit without hesitation. Now, as the rabbit was placed near him, the infant's reaction was immediate and violent. He recoiled, bursting into tears, desperately attempting to crawl away. The fear had mutated. The neurological trauma was no longer bound to the specific white rat. It had attached itself to the concept of fur. Watson, operating with the cold curiosity of an engineer stress testing a bridge, escalated the variables. He presented a dog. Albert screamed. He presented a sealskin coat. Albert violently pushed it away and began to hyperventilate. He presented raw cotton wool. The infant recoiled in terror. Visual, a montage of the terrifying stimuli, growing increasingly surreal and nightmarish. The pacing of the edits accelerates. The ultimate test of this psychological contamination came when Watson himself approached the child. Watson did not bring an animal. He brought a mask. A crude, unsettling mask of Santa Claus, complete with a sprawling white cotton beard. Visual, a slow, distorted pan across the grotesque Santa Claus mask used by Watson. The hollow eyes of the mask stare into the lens. When Watson leaned over the infant wearing the mask, the child did not see a festive icon. His corrupted amygdala processed the white fur of the beard, linked it to the rat, linked the rat to the deafening steel concussion, and triggered an absolute panic response. Albert screamed, thrashing wildly to escape the monstrous figure hovering over him. John B. Watson had not merely created a fear of rats. He had created a contagion of terror that infected every aspect of the child's visual world. He had proven, undeniably, that human emotion was mechanistic. That a soul could be dismantled with a hammer and a steel bar. Pause 3 seconds. Then, the experiment abruptly stopped. Visual, a red, classified/terminated, stamp slams over the clinical ledger. Watson had planned to attempt to uncondition the child, to reverse the damage and cure the phobia he had so meticulously constructed. But that phase of the experiment never occurred. Shortly after the generalization tests, Albert B. was discharged from the Harriet Lane home. His mother took him away, vanishing into the obscurity of 1920s America. The child left the hospital with a brain fundamentally rewired for terror, carrying a manufactured nightmare into the real world. Watson did not search for him. He simply published his findings, cementing his legacy in the annals of psychological history, entirely indifferent to the broken human machine he left behind. Act V, the neurobiological autopsy. Visual, a highly detailed, glowing 3D rendering of the human brain spinning slowly against a black background. The amygdala and the hippocampus illuminate in harsh, warning red colors. Narrator. Analytical, probing, clinically precise. To truly grasp the devastation inflicted upon Albert B., we must step away from Watson's 1920s behavioral framework and perform a modern neurobiological autopsy of the experiment. Watson believed he was merely altering a behavioral output, a simple input-output mechanism. He was entirely blind to the catastrophic internal damage he was causing at a microscopic level. When the carpenter's hammer struck the steel bar, generating a deafening acoustic shockwave, it bypassed Albert's conscious processing entirely. Sound travels through the ear canal, vibrating the tympanic membrane, translating into electrical signals that shoot directly into the brain stem and up into the thalamus. The thalamus acts as a neurological switchboard. In a terrifying event, the thalamus does not route the signal to the prefrontal cortex, the logical, reasoning center of the brain. It routes it directly to the amygdala. Visual, the 3D brain zooms in on the amygdala. A simulated pulse of electricity fires from the thalamus into the amygdala, turning the surrounding tissue a deep, infected crimson. The amygdala is the brain's alarm system. When struck by the sudden, concussive noise, Albert's amygdala violently activated the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The HPA axis. This is the physiological engine of terror. Within milliseconds, the hypothalamus released corticotropin-releasing hormone, signaling the pituitary gland to dump adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream, which in turn violently commanded the adrenal glands to flood the infant's tiny body with cortisol and adrenaline. His heart rate skyrocketed to pump oxygen to his muscles. His pupils dilated to take in maximum visual data. His digestive system shut down entirely. This is the ultimate physiological state of emergency. Visual, a microscopic view of neurons firing wildly, synapses connecting and binding with thick, heavy chains, representing the permanence of trauma. Under normal evolutionary circumstances, once the threat dissipates, the parasympathetic nervous system engages, flooding the body with enzymes to break down the stress hormones and return the organism to homeostasis. But Watson did not allow homeostasis. By repeatedly pairing this catastrophic biological emergency with the visual presence of the white rat, Watson forced a violent neuroplastic adaptation. The brain of an infant is highly plastic, designed to rapidly wire itself based on environmental inputs. Watson hijacked this plasticity. He forced the hippocampus, the memory center, to permanently encode the white rat as the biological equivalent of a mortal threat. He physically rewired the synapses connecting Albert's optic nerve to his amygdala. This was not a behavioral quirk. This was a surgically induced brain lesion disguised as science. Watson had permanently neurologically damaged a child, leaving a scar on the child's neural architecture that no amount of time could simply erase. Act 6, The Search for the Ghost. Visual, a massive wall covered in red string, old census records, faded birth certificates, and blurred photographs of infants from the 1920s. A spotlight slowly pans across the chaotic collage. Narrator. For decades, the true identity of little Albert remained one of the most guarded secrets in the history of psychology. He was a ghost in the machine. A phantom data point in textbooks, discussed in sterile lecture halls without a name, without a face, and without a future. What happened to the boy with the manufactured nightmares? In 2009, a psychologist named Dr. Hall P. Beck launched a meticulous, forensic investigation to unearth the ghost. Beck's methodology was as obsessive as Watson's conditioning protocols. He dug into the archives of the Harriet Lane home, cross-referencing census data, hospital employment records, and the precise dates of Watson's clinical notes. Visual, extreme close-up of a 1920 census document. A finger traces down the list of names, stopping at Pearl Barger. Beck's investigation identified a wet nurse named Arvilla Merritt, who lived on campus at the hospital during the exact window of the experiment. Arvilla had a son. His name was Douglas Merritt. When Beck uncovered the medical history of Douglas Merritt, the Little Albert narrative shifted from a story of psychological manipulation into a realm of profound, sickening tragedy. Douglas Merritt was not a healthy, stolid and unemotional infant as Watson had claimed. Medical records revealed that Douglas suffered from hydrocephalus, a severe neurological condition in which cerebrospinal fluid builds up within the ventricles of the brain, causing immense pressure, brain damage, and severe cognitive impairment. Visual, an old, haunting medical photograph of a child with a slightly enlarged cranium, the eyes looking distantly away from the lens. The photo is deeply shadowed. If Douglas Merritt was Little Albert, it meant Watson had not only tortured a helpless infant, but he had deliberately targeted a neurologically compromised, terminally ill child. It meant the child's lack of initial reaction was not due to a blank slate psychology, but severe neurological suppression. The tragic reality of Douglas Merritt is that he never lived to experience a long life of fear. He died at the age of 6 from hydrocephalus. If Douglas was Albert, the manufactured terror was one of the only intense experiences of his painfully short existence. Pause 3 seconds. But in the cold, chaotic world of historical forensics, nothing is absolute. In 2014, a counter-investigation led by researchers Russ Powell and Nancy Digdon proposed a different candidate. Visual: the red string on the corkboard snaps. The camera shifts to a different birth certificate. William Albert Barger. They identified another wet nurse, Pearl Barger, whose son, William Albert Barger, matched the timeline and the physiological profile with terrifying accuracy. William was born just one day after Douglas Merritt. He was a healthy, robust child. His middle name was Albert, matching Watson's designation of Albert B. William Albert Barger lived a full life. He died in 2007 at the age of 87. When researchers tracked down William's surviving relatives and asked about his life, the familial account sent a chill through the psychological community. William's niece recounted that her uncle had lived his entire adult life with an inexplicable, intense phobia of dogs. He would become visibly distressed and physically avoid any situation where dogs might be present. Furthermore, family members noted that William harbored a deep, irrational aversion to animals in general, particularly those with fur. Visual: a slow, ominous zoom into a modern photograph of an elderly man's empty armchair, bathed in cold, sterile light. Dust motes float in the air. Did John B. Watson's malicious code survive in the brain of William Albert Barger for 87 years? Did an old man live out his days carrying the invisible, unhealed neurological wounds inflicted by a carpenter's hammer in a sterile laboratory in 1920? Whether Albert was Douglas Merritt, who died in tragic agony, or William Barger, who lived a lifetime shadowed by an engineered phobia, the conclusion remains the same. The subject was treated not as a human being, but as raw industrial material. Act 7, the commodification of fear. Visual: the dark, sterile laboratory transitions rapidly through a montage of 1920s and 30s, Madison Avenue advertising. Billboards, magazine clippings selling soap, toothpaste, and coffee. The music shifts to a slow, distorted, terrifying jazz track. Narrator: the ethical violations of the little Albert experiment eventually caught up with John B. Watson, but not for the reasons one might expect. He was not fired from Johns Hopkins University for torturing an infant. He was fired because his affair with his 21-year-old assistant, Rosalie Rayner, became public. The scandal destroyed his academic career. But a man who knows how to program human emotion does not remain unemployed for long. Watson took his knowledge of behaviorism, his mastery of fear and desire, and he sold it to the highest bidder. He moved to New York City and entered the advertising industry. He joined the J. Walter Thompson Agency, one of the largest advertising firms in the world. Visual: a close-up of an old advertisement for Johnson & Johnson baby powder. The text implies that if a mother does not use this product, she is failing her child. The camera zooms in on the terrifying subtext of guilt. Watson realized that the same psychological mechanisms he used to make an infant terrified of a rat could be used to make a consumer terrified of social rejection. He pioneered the fear appeal in advertising. He didn't sell toothpaste by talking about dental hygiene. He sold toothpaste by manufacturing a fear of bad breath, a fear of being socially ostracized, a fear of dying alone. He sold soap by implanting a phobia of invisible, microscopic germs. He engineered insecurity. Watson took the steel bar and the hammer out of the laboratory, and he placed them in every magazine, every radio broadcast, and every billboard in America. He proved that you don't need to physically shock someone to condition them. You just need to control the media they consume. The little Albert experiment never truly ended. It merely evolved. It scaled up from a single infant in a psychiatric clinic to an entire population of consumers. We are all, in a sense, sitting on the mattress, waiting for the hammer to strike. Pause 4 seconds. Visual, the screen fades to black. The rhythmic, low-frequency heartbeat from the cold open returns, pulsing slowly. A final title card appears in stark white text on the black screen. The behaviorist cannot be bothered with the consciousness of man. John B. Watson. Audio, a final, distant, echoing clang of a hammer striking steel. Silence. End of script. Act 8, The Machinery of Compliance, a Philosophical Deconstruction. Visual, the camera slowly tracks down an endless, sterile, white corridor lined with identical, closed doors. A harsh fluorescent light flickers overhead. Narrator. To fully comprehend the darkness of the Little Albert Protocol, we must expand our scope beyond the confines of the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic. The experiment was not an isolated incident of scientific cruelty. It was the genesis of a much larger, much more insidious philosophy of human control, the machinery of compliance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the scientific world was obsessed with demystifying the organic. Ivan Pavlov had already proven that dogs could be conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell. He demonstrated that physiological responses could be hijacked by environmental triggers. But Pavlov's subjects were canines. His experiments, while groundbreaking, did not cross the terrifying threshold of human consciousness. John B. Watson crossed that threshold with a hammer in his hand. He looked at Pavlov's dogs and saw the blueprint for human society. Visual, archival footage of Pavlov's dogs, their mouths wired to collection tubes, juxtaposed with the sterile crib of Little Albert. The imagery is spliced rapidly, creating a disturbing visual parallel. If a dog can be programmed to anticipate food, and an infant can be programmed to anticipate terror, what is the ultimate limit of this biological hacking? Decades after Watson's expulsion from academia, B.F. Skinner would take up the mantle of behaviorism. Skinner developed the concept of operant conditioning. While Watson focused on classical conditioning, pairing an involuntary reflex with a neutral stimulus, Skinner focused on modifying voluntary behavior through reinforcement and punishment. Skinner built what became known as the Skinner box, an operant conditioning chamber where animals were rewarded with food for pressing a lever, or punished with electric shocks for incorrect behaviors. Skinner, like Watson, believed that human beings were essentially no different from the rats and pigeons inside his boxes. He argued that concepts like free will, autonomy, and moral choice were illusions. We are all simply biological machines responding to environmental reinforcements. Visual, a complex, interlocking gear mechanism is shown in extreme macro photography. The gears are turning seamlessly. A sudden drop of dark, corrosive acid falls onto the metal, causing the gears to grind and lock. This is the true, lingering horror of the Little Albert experiment. It stripped humanity of its soul. It reduced the intricate, beautiful complexity of human emotion to a mechanical equation. If free will is an illusion, then the engineer who controls the environment controls the human. Think about the ethical implications. If an authority figure, a government, a corporation, a media conglomerate, can identify the specific steel bars that trigger your deepest anxieties, they do not need to use physical force to control you. They only need to strike the bar. Visual, fast-paced montage of modern society. A stock market ticker plummeting in red ink. A news anchor looking grave. A smartphone screen flashing a barrage of breaking news notifications, each one highlighting words like crisis, threat, and danger. Modern digital algorithms operate on the exact same principles Watson pioneered in 1920. Every time you scroll through a social media feed, you are stepping into a digital Skinner box. The algorithms are designed to measure your baseline responses. They track how long you linger on an image of a rat, a rabbit, or a burning newspaper. When the algorithm identifies the specific stimulus that triggers your amygdala, whether it is political outrage, social anxiety, or existential dread, it pairs that stimulus with the content it wants you to consume. It strikes the invisible steel bar. You feel the spike of cortisol. You feel the accelerated heart rate. You are conditioned to associate the platform with the biological necessity of vigilance. You cannot look away, because your nervous system has been programmed to believe that looking away means you will not see the hammer falling. Pause 3 seconds. Visual. The camera slowly zooms in on a single, isolated server rack in a dark room. The blinking green lights resemble the cold, unfeeling eyes of a predator. Watson's ghost does not just haunt the archives of Johns Hopkins University. His philosophy is the underlying code of the modern attention economy. We are subjected to 1,000 little Albert experiments every single day, our phobias and anxieties meticulously mapped, categorized, and monetized by unseen engineers. Act 9, The Burden of the Blank Slate. Visual. The camera slowly returns to the image of the white rat from the beginning of the experiment. The rat is sitting peacefully on a white surface, grooming itself. Narrator. We must also confront the philosophical arrogance of tabula rasa, the blank slate. Watson's entire premise relied on the belief that Albert B. was an empty vessel, devoid of innate humanity, waiting to be filled with the architect's design. This is the ultimate hubris of the scientific detached observer. When you view a human being as a blank slate, you sever your empathetic connection to them. You are no longer interacting with a person, you are interacting with raw material. This detachment allowed Watson and Rayner to watch a 9-month-old infant collapse into a state of neurological shock, over and over again, without intervening. It allowed them to meticulously document his tears, his hyperventilation, and his desperate attempts to crawl away, not as cries for help, but as successful data points. Visual, a close-up of Watson's handwritten notes. The cursive script is elegant, clinical, and utterly devoid of emotion. The words, "cried violently," are underlined. The tragedy of the little Albert experiment is not just what was done to the child. It is the chilling realization of what the adults were capable of doing. The experiment proved that the most terrifying monster in the room was not the rat, the rabbit, or the dog. The monster was the man with the hammer. Visual, slow fade to black. The sound of a heavy hammer being dragged across a concrete floor echoes in the darkness. The legacy of little Albert remains a dark, permanent stain on the history of psychology. It is a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, of science divorced from morality, and of the profound vulnerability of the human mind. Whether Albert was Douglas Merritt, who died too young to understand what had been done to him, or William Barger, who lived a long life shadowed by an implanted fear, the ethical violation is absolute. They were denied the fundamental right to own their own emotions. Their psychological architecture was vandalized. Pause 4 seconds. As we navigate a world increasingly dominated by behavioral algorithms and fear-based conditioning, we must ask ourselves a terrifying question. Who is holding the hammer today? And what are they teaching us to fear? Audio, a final, distant, echoing clang of a hammer striking steel. Total silence. End of script. Appendix, image prompts for AI generation. 1. Visual, the cold open waveform. Image prompt, a pitch-black background with a single, aggressive, jagged audio waveform spiking violently in the center. The waveform should be a harsh, metallic silver or warning red color, conveying the sudden, deafening impact of a hammer striking steel. Clinical, minimalist, and ominous. 2. Visual, Watson's blueprint of the mind. Image prompt, a 1920s-style architectural blueprint overlaid on an anatomical diagram of a human infant's brain. Harsh, geometric lines connect the eyes and ears to the amygdala. The blueprint features clinical, mathematical equations and the stamped words, stimulus, and response, in faded black ink. 3. Visual, the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic. Image prompt, a bleak, gothic, and imposing exterior view of the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in 1920. The sky is overcast and gray. The architecture should look cold, institutional, and unwelcoming, shot from a low angle to make the building look dominating. 4. Visual, the blank slate. Image prompt, a vintage, sepia-ed photograph style. A 9-month-old infant sitting on a sterile, white hospital mattress in a dimly lit, empty room. The infant's expression is completely neutral, staring blankly ahead. No toys, no comfort items. The lighting should cast long, cold shadows. 5. Visual, the baseline calibration the rat. Image prompt, a close-up, high-contrast black and white image. A small, white laboratory rat sitting on a dark surface. A tiny, chubby infant's hand is reaching out tentatively to touch the rat's fur. The mood should be innocent but laced with a sense of impending doom. 6. Visual, the weapon the steel bar and hammer. Image prompt, a stark, clinical photograph of a heavy, iron carpenter's hammer resting next to a 4-foot-long, thick steel bar on a wooden table. The lighting is harsh overhead, highlighting the scratches and heavy weight of the tools. It should look like a weapon of blunt force trauma. 7. Visual, the shockwave. Image prompt, a distorted, motion blur effect image simulating panic. The perspective is from behind a crib. An infant is recoiling violently, falling sideways onto a mattress, face obscured. The edges of the image are blurred and vibrating, visually representing a deafening, concussive sound wave. 8. Visual, the contagion the rabbit. Image prompt, a vintage 1920s laboratory setting. A white rabbit is placed on a mattress. In the background, out of focus, an infant is scrambling frantically away in sheer terror. The focus is sharp on the rabbit, which sits perfectly still, contrasting the chaos in the background. 9. Visual, the grotesque Santa mask. Image prompt, a terrifying, crude, 1920s era Santa Claus mask with hollow, empty eye holes and a sprawling, rough white cotton beard. The mask is being held up by a man in a white laboratory coat whose face is obscured. The lighting is dramatic and shadowy, making the mask look nightmarish and demonic. 10. Visual, the neurobiological autopsy. Image prompt, a highly detailed, 3D medical rendering of a human brain glowing against a pure black background. The amygdala region in the center is glowing fiercely in a toxic, warning red color, with lightning-like neural pathways firing aggressively outward, symbolizing panic and trauma. 11. Visual, the ghost in the archives. Image prompt, a massive, chaotic corkboard covered in faded 1920s census records, birth certificates, and blurry photos of infants. Red string connects various documents in a complex web. The lighting is dim, like a detective's office late at night. The name, Harriet Lane Home, is visible on one document. 12. Visual, Douglas Merritt's tragedy. Image prompt, a haunting, heavily shadowed, vintage medical photograph style of an infant's face. The child looks frail, staring distantly away from the camera. The image should evoke deep sorrow and clinical tragedy, representing the neurological suffering of hydrocephalus. 13. Visual, William Barger's empty chair. Image prompt, a modern photograph. An empty, worn leather armchair sitting in a dimly lit room. A single shaft of cold window light illuminates the dust motes floating above the chair. A framed, blurry 1920s photo of an infant sits on a small table next to it. Evokes the long shadow of a lifelong phobia. 14. Visual, the commodification of fear. Image prompt, a collage of 1920s and 1930s vintage advertising posters selling soap and baby products. The posters are torn and layered over each other. Hidden faintly in the background of the advertisements is the silhouette of a man holding a hammer. 15. Visual, the modern Skinner box. Image prompt, a glowing smartphone screen in a pitch-black room. The screen displays an endless, fast-moving feed of abstract warning symbols and alarming text. A human thumb is endlessly swiping up. The light from the screen casts a cold, bluish, terrified glow on the unseen user.